All right. Hi, everyone. I am Andrew, aka Mindgasms the Mage, for the purposes of this video. And I'm going to talk about Deadhouse Gates, Book 2 in Steven Erikson's grimdark epic fantasy series, which is an awesome series that I've been getting into. And I made a spoiler-free video about Book 1, Gardens of the Moon, so check that out as well. And I made a video about how the series, Malazan Book of the Fallen, is postmodern fantasy because it doesn't follow traditional fantasy tropes at all. It's not heroes going on an epic quest to defeat evil with some magic object or something like that, something like Tolkien. And it has more, perhaps more pulpy elements, like something like Robert E. Howard's Conan series, I would say, which I think is interesting. I've been hearing some other fantasy book nerds talking about that on podcasts. Anyway, um, so this is oh wait, just a second here. Let me sure. Oh, my mic might be a little loud there. Okay. So yeah, like the title says here, there's a lot of awesome and fascinating and dark and not awesome, dark and not awesome stuff, but that gives it the grim dark feel in this book. So there, all these types of magic users, mages, all the like different types, mages, witches, wizards, etc. And there are people who do prostitution for the sake of their mission, a whole bunch of different types of monsters, which it leads up to a war. And basically, I heard that I looked this up, and this book takes place at the same time as the events of book 3, called Memory of Ice. And I've read that one recently, and it basically ends up being full on military grimdark fantasy. I would say it's really cool. It's a lot of setup and then a whole bunch of like smaller battles in an extremely large war. But anyway, so the one of the main ways that Malazan in general seems to be different from a lot of other fantasy series, and this applies to the difference between book 1 and book 2, is that book 2 takes places mostly in different parts of the Malazan Empire, and it mostly explores completely different, like takes place rather from the perspective of completely different characters from those in book 1. Some of them have nothing to do with them, and some of them are somewhat related tangentially. And yeah, I just think it's really interesting, this different way to explore a fantasy series and to have such a massive world and so many characters. And just I try to look at it as an anthology series, really, that way, like almost something like more of a series of short stories, but there is still kind of a loose cohesive narrative. But the I think as you read more of these books, especially to me, as you get into book 3, you start to really get a better understanding of the broader themes that are going on and the broader power struggles and factions and all that kind of stuff. It's like this series is probably more massive in scope than anything I've ever read, for sure. And it's why a lot of people say that Malazan is the most, like, the largest world in all of the history of fantasy, or the most complex and detailed one. Which, I mean, seems true to me. I mean, I've read a lot of fantasy, but certainly not all of it by any measure. But anyway, so yeah, I I would say like, if you've seen my review for book 1, Gardens of the Moon, my favorite character in that one is Anomander Rake. And in this one, he's just mentioned by another character offhandedly. We don't actually see him at all in this book. And like I said at the beginning, that's because he's often the events of book 3 that are taking place, if I understand correctly, roughly simultaneously as the events in book 2. So it makes sense that he wouldn't be in two places at once, obviously, right? Although it wouldn't surprise me if characters in the Malazan world have this some sort of magic power that does allow them to be in two places at once. But so anyway, so yeah, my favorite character in book 1 was Anamanda Rake, who's this giant, just coal black kind of shape-shifting demon called one of the Talan Imas, which are these kind of ancient gods, kind of, or demigods with magic powers. And one of them is that he can shapeshift into a fucking dragon, which is why he was my favorite character in book 1. And so, but in comparison to book 1, my favorite character is Kalam instead in book 2. And that's one of the few characters who is in book 2 who is also in book 1. He's an assassin who's in a specific assassin guild that is in basically a civil war with another assassin guild in book 1, Gardens of the Moon. And he's basically off on some other mission in this book. And he's my favorite character because mostly just because he gets into all sorts of awesome battle sequences. And an interesting aspect of this world that I mentioned before is that it's kind of unclear. It seems a little more clear in book 3 and even more clear here in book 2 than it was in book 1, that it seems like there are certain people who have a certain level, like of varying degrees of natural magical ability, and well, like what they can do depends on that. So the Kalam I mentioned, he can use specific types of magic powers, and other characters cannot, which if I like which makes sense now that you think about it, because I know more about how the magic system works. Because in, like I was saying in my previous review, I think the way the magic system works is with these things called warrens, which are actually, they're kind of like portals that you access, that you travel into, but they're actually physical places. And so you basically, you like kind of in a non-physical or perhaps some sort of metaphysical or magic way, pull energy from a warren to be able to use magic. So Kalam has specific magical abilities that apply more specifically to being an assassin. So that makes sense, because it probably means that he can access certain warrens that other characters cannot access, and then there are probably some overlaps. There are probably multiple characters who can access the same warrens, and so he can probably access warrens that other characters can't, and then other characters can probably access warrens that he can't access. So anyway, another interesting character in Deadhouse Gates is Felison, who's related to Ganos Paran, who is not in this book, but this is his younger sister. So that's one of the only that's another loose connection between book 1 and 2, not a direct connection. But anyway, Felison basically, so it seems like she's actually a princess, but basically she goes on a journey with these two people who have magic abilities, and one of them, they have some sort of mystical or holy thing about them because they lost their hands for pissing off some god, basically. And she goes on this epic quest, and at one point uh, basically she prostitutes herself to this guy for the mission. And also she does that sometimes because she's a junkie, she's a drug addict to this substance that seems like, I don't know, some sort of alcohol or something like that. It seems like some sort of opiate type of alcohol, it's hard to tell. And also in terms of I was just thinking in terms of the plot in general, they're also, one of the most awesome aspects of these books is that they're long, epic fantasy books, but they're not boring. The pacing is awesome because there's a whole bunch. there's a whole bunch of awesome stuff that happens in these books. So there are all these characters going off on these separate quests, right? And then there are multiple of these sets of characters repeatedly get into these awesome magic battles, throwing like magic fireballs at each other and fighting different kinds of monsters and demons and ghosts and their gods and demigods with conflicting interests, trying to like often directly manipulating human events and having competing loyalties. And yeah, there's also a historian who is in this book named Dweeker, and he is with the chain of dogs, which is being which is basically a giant group of refugees that is being escorted by an army. Um, I forget which army it is, but I was gonna say it's Whiskey Jack's army, but he has his bridge burners and his Malazan army in the events that are happening in book 3 in Memories of Ice. But anyway, the Dweeker, along with another magic user, is with is with these refugees that are being escorted by this army, and they get into all of these fucking awesome magic battles with stuff, people opening like magic users opening up warrens to have demons and monsters pop out of them and then close them and have these demons and monsters cause havoc on all of the enemies. And then there are these awesome heroes with magic swords fighting demons and monsters and stuff. And yeah, there's a hell of a lot of awesome stuff that happens in this book. And then there's a mass failure and mass genocide and execution at the end. And another loose connection between book 1 and book 2 is that some of the characters go on a quest related to Quick Ben, who is one of the wizards the in Whiskey Jack's Bridge Burners Malazan army in book 1. And so that's another interesting kind of loose connection there too. And another, there's so many interesting hardcore fantasy aspects of all of the events that happen in these books. And one of them is basically that some of the characters get tangled up in this plot where they're trying to release this basically this renegade kind of like demon god from a warren in which it's imprisoned, but it doesn't want to be let out. It doesn't want to escape, but they're trying to do that anyway. And there are all sorts of just these awesome hardcore fantasy aspects and epic magic battles and fighting monsters, war, junkies, prostitution, all sorts of like really dark, violent, grim, dark shit. So if you like Game of Thrones / Song of Ice and Fire and First Law, as we've talked about, me and my fantasy nerd friends, Tristram and Dusty, then you would like the Malazan series. And it's really awesome. So I highly recommend it, especially even if you don't normally like epic fantasy series because they just get slow. And I totally agree with that too. They definitely get slow sometimes. But to me, so far, maybe book 3 is a little bit different, but I wouldn't say that different at all. But basically, there are hardly any dull moments in these books at all. The plot is very fast, that moves very quickly, and it switches between all these characters, and you have to just go along for the ride and try and stop trying to figure out. That's what I've heard some booktubers say about it, and I think that's really good advice because there are just so many characters and locations and events and competing interests going on that it's virtually impossible to keep track of them, but you'll start to get more and more of it as you go on. And like I said, I started to gain understand a lot more of it in book 3, but we'll see how much that changes and how many more times the setting changes and how many more times we switch between different locations and everything like that. So yeah, I think this is pretty good. Basically, I basically just told you uh, the essential elements of the plot and some of the characters in it. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for this basically spoiler-free review of Deadhouse Gates, Book 2 of Steven Erikson's epic grimdark fantasy series, which I highly recommend. So far, I gave this book a rating of 4.5, or sorry, you can't give half ratings. 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, so almost a perfect book, which is a great rating. I rate very few books 5 stars, but I read so many books that I have rated a lot of them, but in comparison to all of the books that I read, not that very many. But to me, all 3 of the Malazan books so far weren't 4 stars and are fucking awesome books. And I'm definitely going to read all 10 or 15 or so, or however many of these awesome, super thick books are. So if you're a hardcore fantasy nerd like me, then you should definitely read this series. So yeah, check out Deadhouse Gates, Gardens of the Moon, Memories of Ice, and all the other books in the Malazan series, along with the other ones written by Ian C. Esselman, which I want to get to at some point too. All right, so yeah, thanks everyone for watching this spoiler-free review of Deadhouse Gates. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you find this awesome, epic, grimdark fantasy series as fascinating as me. Let me know what you think about the series in the comments if you read it, and if you haven't, you should totally check it out again. All right, so yeah, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Share this video everywhere with all of your fantasy nerd friends and even people who haven't read it because I didn't spoil anything. And click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Check out my last ones. Last one I did was a podcast with my friend Dusty, who I often talk with about Fat Man, which is a some perhaps somewhat anti-capitalist and an anti-military, serious, grim Christmas movie in which Mel Gibson plays this grim gunfighter Santa Claus, and elves manufacture weapons for the U.S. military. So check that out. And then also this weekend, I'm probably going to be talking with my friend Dusty about Wastelands, book 3 in Stephen King's Dark Tower, basically fantasy western horror series, which is really awesome and has a whole bunch of connections to his other books and takes places in his interconnected Ka universe, similar to Brandon Sanderson's interconnected Cosmere universe. If any of you fantasy nerds watching this have read those, so yeah, check out that upcoming conversation. And if that might not be, we might have to do a backup instead of that one, which would be Golden Sun, which is book 2 in the Red Rising sci-fi series, which becomes like a hardcore sci-fi fantasy series and then more of a hardcore sci-fi series. And it's a really cool series that takes place on Mars and is about class struggle and revolution. And it has all this awesome technology and a whole bunch of awesome events going on. So check out whichever one of those chats is going to be this weekend. And yeah, check out my Patreon. My Patreon page, link is in the description as always. And like I always say, I love you all, keeping the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And check out Malazan if you haven't already. It's a really awesome series. Read Gardens of the Moon, then Deadhouse Gates, then Memories of Ice, and then continue on with book 4 with me. I will do a review of book 3, Memories of Ice, soon, since I've just finished that one as well. And then we're definitely going to continue on to book 4 too. So if you want to read these along with me, or if you've already read them, check out my future videos on that. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.